My goodness, do I got a stream for you today. Courtesy of Fingon himself, we have a slew of spoilers over on the Discord. These are not official spoilers for spoiler season, these are leaks. Someone got their hands on product, cracked a bunch of packs, and it's a ton of rares. It's probably like half the rares in the set. It looks pretty wild. Maybe not half the rares in the set, but close to it. We're gonna pop in really quick. We're gonna take a look. All right, so we're gonna start with Migla's Maze Crusher. This is a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian beast for 1 green, 1 red, and 1. It's a rare, so already it's a 4/4 for 3. Granted, it's legendary. He enters the battlefield with 5 oil counters on him. You can pay 1, remove 1 oil counter to give it Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. What's going on, Finn? You can pay 2, remove 2 oil counters to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. You can pay 3, remove 3 oil counters to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Finn, these cards seem kind of insane, especially the green stuff. We were talking about how green wasn't very viable in Standard right now. I think that's going to change. Even just a 4/4 for 3, this guy's really good. And then you get any combination of these abilities. You could destroy an artifact or enchantment and give it +2/+2 one of the combats. You could destroy an artifact or enchantment, give it Vigilance and Menace 2 different combats. Or you could give it Vigilance and Menace 5 different combats. Or you could pump it +2/+2 2 different combats, and then 1 combat give it Vigilance and Menace. I think the threat of activation is what makes this so good, because again, just being a 4/4 for 3 mana is pretty good, and then constantly having this threat of activation on it makes it really hard for your opponent to block. You just you swing in. I mean, granted, the 1 mana ability you're going to want to use before you swing in. But if you've got at least 2 mana open, and at least 2 oil counters left on it, it's really hard for your opponent to block this. And you don't ever have to actually pay the 2, remove the 2 oil counters, and give it +2/+2. But the fact that you can do it means your opponent doesn't want to block it unless they're just chumping. They don't want to try to trade with it. And then you just don't spend the mana, and then you have all your mana available second main phase, and you just play what you normally would play. So a lot of versatility with this card. The fact that it's got artifact and enchantment removal built into it while still being an above rate creature is just kind of insane. Normally when we see creatures that can destroy an artifact or enchantment, they're either really small or they're just not quite on rate. We've seen some really big creatures that have the ability to destroy artifacts and enchantments, but they're super expensive. This is aggressively costed for a card that can be in an aggressive or mid-range deck without really any downsides, and then all of these charm abilities, we'll call them, are just pure upside. It seems really good. Next up, we've got the Seed Core. Now you're going to see a theme in some of these cards. There are land types Sphere and land type, I forget what the other one's called, but we'll see it as we get into the spoilers. There's another land type as well, and there are cards that interact with these land types. So this is land Sphere. This is a rare land, the Seed Core. You can tap it for a colorless. You could tap it for a mana of any color as long as you only spend that mana to cast a Phyrexian creature spell. So you can't use that for abilities. You can't use it for non-creature spells. You can only use it for creatures that are Phyrexians. But still, a mana of any color for a creature that's Phyrexian seems pretty decent if your deck is built around that. You can maybe do like a 2 or 3 color deck as far as your creatures are concerned, when really the core of your deck just revolves around 1 or maybe 2 of the colors, and you're only splashing for certain Phyrexian creatures. That makes this really easy to use for a deck like that. And then it also has a corrupted ability on top of it, where you can tap it, give target 1/1 creature +2/+1 until end of turn, but you can only activate that if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So That's what Corrupted does. Corrupted is an ability that turns on if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. I think poison counters are going to be pretty important in the limited format. Not even necessarily just to win as, but I think just having a bunch of cards that can give poison counters just incidentally, even if you're not going so heavy into them that you're expecting to win with them, is going to be important because it will turn on these corrupted keywords. So that's something to pay attention to. Next up, we've got the Argentum Masticore. Now, if anyone sees anything crazy or has any crazy ideas that I'm not talking about while I'm going over these cards, make sure and shout them out in the chat. Let me know the ways in which you're thinking maybe you might try to use it, or, you know, in what ways these cards might hint at what else is left in the set, etc. So this is a 5/5 artifact creature, Phyrexian Masticore for 5 mana. It's pretty sick that we have a Phyrexian Masticore here. At the beginning of your upkeep, first strike, protection from multicolor, 5/5 for 5. So it's already pretty decent. I mean, 5/5 first strike is nothing to scoff at. Multicolor removal spells can't touch it. Multicolor creatures can't block it. And it can block the biggest multicolor creature in the world and be fine. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice Argentum Masticore unless you discard a card. When you discard a card this way, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to the mana value of the discarded card. So, this is pretty rad. The Masticore is your favorite so far, Paradabo? Is that what you're saying? I think this guy is pretty sick. The way I'm thinking to use it first off is in some kind of a recursion deck where you have a lot of high cost creatures, but you're not necessarily casting them for their costs. You're able to discard them with the Masticore to bring them back with your recursion spells, while also basically killing anything, because their converted mana cost is going to be so high, you'll basically be able to nuke any permanent in play without spending any mana by just discarding the thing, and then it's in your graveyard to bring back with a recursion spell. Yeah, Portal. There you go. Portal's a good example. We can discard the Portal to kill something, and then use the Portal, get back the Portal with some of the other non-creature recursion spells. There's a lot of crazy things you can do with this Masticore. I definitely think you want to build it around utilizing its discard outlet. You want things discarded that you can use in the yard in some way. But even if you don't do that, like a 5/5 first strike for 5 with this ability is pretty wild. The only real problem... Hey, it back full size? Oh, right. The prototype guys. Exactly. Actually, the prototype guys are kind of perfect, because if you want to play them, you can play them for their cheap costs, but if you don't play them and you discard them, they're going to count the higher converted mana cost in order to nuke something, and then if you're using recursion, it's going to bring back the bigger version. So it's a way to have a card you can discard to nuke a high CMC target, while not necessarily being a waste of a card in your hand that you can't cast for a cheaper cost if you don't want to use it for that. You're a people that can play, it's true. I think this guy's really cool. My only real concern is the fact that it is a 5 mana creature that doesn't do anything the turn it comes into play. If this triggered at the end of turn instead of at the beginning of your upkeep, then it would be insanely good. Because you'd get an activation off of it before your opponent gets to use sorcery speed removal. But as it stands, you could pay 5 mana, it doesn't have any ward or anything, you put it out there, your opponent just kills it on their turn, and then they're ahead tempo wise because their removal spell costs less than the Masticore. And that fact makes me think even more that it belongs in a recursion deck. For 2 reasons. One, in a recursion deck, if they kill it, it's not as big a deal, because you have things in the deck that are meant to bring things back from the yard. But also in a recursion deck, most of your threats are going to be even more problematic than this guy. So it's like, if they've got one piece of removal in their hand, do they kill the Masticore? Or do they kill the giant recursion target you brought back? Or do they save it to kill the giant recursion target you're about to bring back next turn? So I think in that deck, this guy slots in a little bit better. He feels a little Shieldred-y, in that when Shieldred was spoiled, I didn't know if it was going to be good enough, because it was 4 mana, didn't really do anything the turn it came into play. But because of how the decks that Shieldred is in sequence out, the card's actually really, really good. This could be similar. Depending on how you curve it out in a deck, it might not matter that it comes out M5 and is susceptible to removal, because your opponent might be too busy dealing with your other stuff from turn 3 and turn 4. I like it a lot, though. Definitely want to build around it. Next up, we've got Venerated Rot Priest. This is 1 green mana for a 1/2 Phyrexian Druid. Has Toxic 1. So, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player will get a poison counter. I was sleeping on the big Phyrexian mommy. Well, I haven't looked through all of these yet. I was busy making content the first part of the day. I had to finish the deck tech to upload. And then I also very quickly just found what I thought was a really good spoiler and made a spoiler video for it, which is the new Wandering Emperor Planeswalker, the Eternal Wanderer. So that spoiler short is up on my YouTube right now for the Eternal Wanderer. So I got those out before I jumped on stream, so I'm a little late on stream today, and I've skimmed through these leaked spoilers, but I haven't gone over them in detail. So 1/2 Toxic 1 for 1 green. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. It's kind of interesting in multiplayer, because like the guy to your right can target you with a spell, target one of your creatures with a spell, and you can put a poison counter on the guy to your left, which is pretty interesting. But I think this is a lot of value in the 1-drop. It makes sense since it's a rare. We don't normally see rares in the 1-drop slot, but 1/2 Toxic 1 that also hands out poison counters whenever your creatures get targeted by spells seems really good. Another thing to take into account is it's not just when they become targeted by spells your opponents control. You could play this in the Simic deck there with the little fairy. The fairy that whenever you target one of your creatures with something, you also target the fairy. I forget what that card's called off the top of my head. But there's that, and there's the, I think it's a Drake, a two mana Drake. When you target it, you get to draw a card. And they use things like Slip Out the Back. Yeah, Ivy. That deck would probably love this, especially if there's more cards that can slot into that reinforce the toxic keyword, or just the poison counters in general. Maybe some proliferate cards. I could see you really going off, especially because this guy just costs 1 mana, you know? If you're casting your own spells on your guys to protect them, and that's triggering your opponents getting poison counters, you don't even ever need to attack, right? It's a completely different, I think it's a completely different archetype built around similar fundamentals to the Ivy deck, where you have an assortment of creatures that want to be targeted and an assortment of spells that can save those creatures, but instead of trying to make those creatures be aggressive and deal enough damage and kill quick, you could focus more on being defensive, having those creatures kind of hold the line, and just killing your opponent with poison counters as you keep the board gummed up with them. Seems like a really good card for only 1 mana. Next up, we've got Zenith Chronicler. 2 mana for a 3/1 Phyrexian Construct. Whenever a player casts their first multicolored spell each turn, each other player draws a card. This is pretty cool. The only thing that kind of stinks about it is if you cast a multicolor spell, your opponent gets to draw a card. So there isn't a way to abuse this where you can draw cards off of playing certain cards yourself. It more comes down to using this as almost like a sideboard card maybe, or being a 3/1 for 2 mana. It might even be main deckable in the right deck that's focused around going wide with artifacts, or being aggressive with artifact creatures in some way. But really that ability is meant to be kind of like a sideboard ability where if you're playing against a deck that's using a lot of multicolor spells, you can side this in, and every turn that they cast a multicolor spell, you get to draw an extra card. And as long as you're not playing any multicolor spells, you don't ever have to worry about the downside. And if they use their removal up on it, I mean, they use their removal up on your 2-drop, and there's probably better things in your deck that they now can't kill. So I think this card could be a really good sideboard card if the right decks spring up that are heavily into multicolor spells. Next up, we've got Thrun, Breaker of Silence. This guy's kinda gnarly. 2 green and 3, so total of 5 mana for a 5/5 legendary troll shaman. It can't be countered. It has trample. As long as it's your turn, it has indestructible. And it can't be the target of non-creature spells your opponents control or abilities, or sorry, can't be the target of non-green spells that your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control. So this thing is really hard to stop. It's swinging in as a 5/5 trample indestructible every turn for 5 mana. That's pretty on rate. You just keep swinging, and they can't really do anything about it. 5/5 trample indestructible, but also they can't counter it the turn it comes down, and they can't target it with non-green spells or abilities from non-green sources. So, like, if you're not running green, like, how do you kill this? It's not even, like, colored spells or abilities. Because if it was that, you could use, like, maybe an artifact to deal with it or something. Some sort of colorless removal. You can't even do that. The only removal that can hit this thing is green removal. So it's almost impossible to kill. On the attack, you can't kill it in combat because it has indestructible. You can't target it with anything that isn't green. You can't counter it. The only real way to stop this is to be running green in some way, with some sort of green removal, maybe a fight spell, or to play a board wipe. Or maybe a removal spell that makes your opponent sacrifice it. There's a couple little outs, but for the most part, this guy's just incredibly difficult to stop. The fact that they just can't get rid of it, except for very few, very specific ways, but it's also swinging in as a 5/5 trample indestructible every turn on the attack. The two of those things coupled together are just insane. I think green's coming back in a big way, especially because we already saw that 3-drop Gruul card. It was the first card we spoiled today. Super insane. Alright. Next up, we've got Red Sun's Twilight. This is 2 red and X for a sorcery. Destroy up to X target artifacts. If X is 5 or more, for each artifact destroyed this way, you create a token that's a copy of it. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. So, pretty insane sideboard card against artifact decks, if you happen to be running a red deck. If they go wide with a bunch of artifacts, you just destroy them all and make copies of them with haste, as long as you're spending at least 7 mana. It does mean you want to be spending at least 7 mana on this, which means you want to be in some sort of a ramp deck. And it also means that you want to be using this against your opponent's artifacts. I was trying to think of ways you could target your own artifacts and get value off of it, but I don't really think it's possible. Unless you're somehow able to utilize all those artifacts going to the graveyard that turn for very cheap. Like if you had some way for no mana to just bring all your artifacts back from the graveyard in one fell swoop, then casting this on your own artifacts is basically going to double it, because you're going to make copies of everything. They're all going to go to the graveyard, and then you're going to, you know, bring them all back for free, and they're all going to have haste, and it's all going to be shenanigans. But I don't think there's really a card that does that. So there's ways, depending on what cards exist in this set, that you could theoretically abuse this by destroying your own artifacts, but I highly doubt it. Most of the time, I think this is going to be a very specific sideboard card in very specific decks against very specific decks. But in those circumstances, it can be really powerful. Next up, we've got Venser, Corpse Puppet. This guy looks really cool. This is a 1/3 legendary Phyrexian zombie wizard for 1 black and 1 blue. So a total of 2 mana for a 1/3 with lifelink and toxic 1. That's a lot for a 2 mana creature already. It also has, whenever you proliferate, you get to choose one. Either, if you don't control a creature named the Hollowed Sentinel, you create the Hollowed Sentinel, which is a legendary 3/3 colorless Phyrexian golem artifact creature token. Or, target artifact creature you control gets flying and lifelink until end of turn. So the first time you proliferate, if you've already hit with Toxic, your opponent's getting more poison counters first off, which is kind of insane. But you're also making a 3/3 dude. The next time you proliferate, your opponent's getting more poison counters, and you're giving your golem flying and lifelink, so it can swing in. Or giving an even better creature potentially flying and lifelink. Or if you want to skip the golem altogether, you could just give any artifact creature flying and lifelink anytime you proliferate. And just ignore the whole golem thing altogether if you want to. A lot of versatility and value packed into this one card. If proliferate is... If proliferate is consistent enough within this set, and there's enough of it going around, this could be a really powerful card, and proliferate in general could end up being really powerful with all the toxic keywords floating around and all the poison counter shenanigans. So, should be pretty crazy. I like this guy. Next up, we've got the Mycosynth Gardens. Now, this is another sphere like I was talking about earlier. There's a couple of different land types in this set that have things that interact with them, sphere being one of them. You can tap this to add 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 1 colorless and tap it to add 1 mana of any color, so it's a filter land. Or, you can pay X and tap this, and the Mycosynth Gardens becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. I can't think of exactly what I would use this for off the top of my head, but this has to be powerful, right? Copy any artifact just by paying X. And what's cool about this is the land can't be countered. So the land's just there. It's in play. It's helping you hit your land drops and play the things you want to play. And then eventually, without your opponent being able to counter it, it's just becoming a copy of any artifact that you control. It can be a creature or a non-creature, whatever. Seems like it could be super powerful. Yeah, it seems like, man, there's just so many crazy artifacts this thing could copy, right? The fact that you get that as extra on top of a land that's probably just fine in a deck to begin with, seems like it's probably pretty powerful. I think this guy will be pretty good. Next up, we've got the White Sun card. So this is White Sun's Twilight. 2 white and X for a sorcery. You gain X life and create X 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1. And this creature can't block. On top of that, if X is 5 or more, you destroy all other creatures. So, this is pretty insane. The life gain is going to help stave off early aggro while also letting you go wide with a bunch of creatures. But if you end up paying a total of 7 mana or more at least, you also wipe your opponent's whole board while keeping all of the Phyrexian mites that you create and gaining at least 5 life. Like, that seems gnarly. I think ramping into this card and just wiping your opponent's board and giving yourself a board and life all in one fell swoop is probably going to be pretty powerful. Definitely a ramp deck with this card in it is going to exist 100%. But really the key is getting to that 7 mana. You can't use Power Stones because it's a sorcery, so you really have to use like traditional ramp or maybe something in this new set that we haven't seen yet. Next up, we've got Mythic, Crucible Goliath. This is 1 red, 1 black, and 2 for a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian beast. So it's a 4/4 for 4. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value, put it onto the battlefield, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is a really interesting ability and a little weird, and you have to really build around it to make it work. So it's a 4/4 for 4, and once a turn, you get to sack something, reveal cards until you reveal a creature that's costs less, and then put that into play. So the key here is you're never going to get a better creature than what you're sacrificing. So in order to really make this ability useful, you either need creatures with enter the battlefield triggers, so that even though you're technically getting a lesser creature off of the sacrifice, you're triggering an extra enter the battlefield ability, and getting value that way. Or you want to be playing with creatures that want to be in your graveyard for some reason. Maybe they have Unearth or some other kind of ability where they matter from the graveyard, and you're able to maybe set up a loop where every turn you're sacrificing something to fetch something, and then that thing that's in the graveyard you're now able to utilize in a certain way to get value off of. I think that's the best way to make use of this card, but he doesn't seem super pushed or over the top, so I have to assume that there are other cards in this set that pair well with this and that support this mechanic, that give it a little bit of an extra push. And I don't think we've seen any of those cards yet, but I'm looking forward to seeing what sorts of things are going to kind of push Mythic over the top. We'll see. Next up, we've got this boy. Now, I've already, or I should say girl. This girl. I've already made a spoiler short video on the channel, so check that out if you haven't already for this card. And I plan on doing spoiler shorts for the rest of them pretty soon. This is the new Wandering Emperor Planeswalker, which was leaked today. So this is 5 mana for a, 6 mana for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. It's 2 white and 4. It has a static ability that only 1 creature is able to attack the Eternal Wanderer each turn. So as long as you keep your loyalty high and or just have a way to kill a creature at instant speed, they can only ever attack this with 1, and then in response you can kill that 1. Or as long as you just have 1 blocker, you can always block the 1 creature. They can't just go wide and get around your blockers and kill this. So as long as you just have a blocker or 1 piece of instant speed spot removal, like, they're never going to be able to swing in and kill this guy, which is really cool. +1 ability, or this girl, sorry. +1 ability, exile up to 1 target artifact or creature, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of that player's next end step. Now, this is cool for a few different reasons. First off, as an uptick, a removal ability is really, really good. Normally, removal abilities are downticks. This is upticking while removing. But there's a few different ways you can utilize it. The most obvious is you hit their biggest threat. they can't block with it, and then on their turn, they can't attack with it, and then at the end of their turn, it comes back. So that's the most obvious way. But you can also use this, like Finn's mentioning in chat right now. You can use this to to flicker one of your own creatures, and it will come back at the end of your turn. So if you want to re-trigger an enters the battlefield ability or something like that, or maybe make some counters fall off of a creature, or maybe make an enchantment fall off of a creature, maybe your opponent played a pacifism on your creature, there's a bunch of different ways you can utilize flickering this, bringing it back into play. Yes, it's also really good with Portal. Super good with Portal to Phyrexia. So you can re-trigger things by flickering your own guy. But the other way that you can use this that might be overlooked a bit is if your opponent happens to steal any of your stuff. Not only do you remove that threat from the field on their side, but it comes back into play on your side, because it comes back into play under the owner's control. So I don't know how prominent stealing is going to be in this set, or in, say, the standard environment after this set comes in. But if stealing is a thing in any significant way, you can actually gain loyalty while stealing your thing back, which is pretty powerful. The second loyalty ability is 0 loyalty to create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with double strike. The fact that you get a 2/2 double striker for 0 loyalty is nuts. And I feel like a lot of these abilities, it can kind of be overlooked how good they can be. But it's definitely, these abilities are powerful enough that it deserves the 6 mana cost. I think some people might see the 6 mana cost and shy away from using this. I think some people might look at the abilities and be a little bit underwhelmed by the first 2 abilities. But really, these abilities in subtle ways are much better than they look like, mostly because of what they cost for loyalty. Like, being able to pay 0 loyalty to make a 2/2 double striker every turn is pretty nuts. Being able to go up in loyalty while dealing with your opponent's biggest threat for a turn, or flickering your own thing, or getting something they stole back, is also nuts because you're gaining loyalty while doing it. She can only be attacked by 1 creature each combat, which is just gravy. And then you have the ultimate here. Now this is -4 loyalty. For each player, you choose a creature that player controls, and each player sacrifices all creatures they control not chosen this way. So this is really good in a deck where you're maybe creature light. Maybe you're playing a control deck and you have just 1 big creature. Maybe you're playing, Portal to Phyrexia, and you're just bringing back 1 really big creature. You get to keep your big thing, make them get rid of everything except their best thing. But then if you have spot removal as well, you can get rid of that as well. Also, there are things that can give you value off of making your opponent sacrifice. Indestructible doesn't dodge it, right? Hexproof or ward doesn't get around it. Their board's just gone, except for 1 dude. Yes, and that's the other thing that might be easily overlooked, and the reason this is worth 6 mana is because you can use the ultimate immediately and still have a 1 loyalty Planeswalker left on the field, which is just gnarly. So I think what's going to be overlooked the most about this card is just the fact that the loyalty costs are so good. The loyalty abilities themselves aren't anything insane when you take into account that this is a 6 mana card. But I think what a lot of people will overlook is the loyalty costs. I think if the loyalty costs were higher on this, if it was a traditional ultimate that you had to build up to, if that removal as the first one was a downtick instead of an uptick like you would normally see for removal, and, you know, if that 0 ability was a -1, like, I feel like the fact that it's a 6-mana Planeswalker is what makes these loyalty abilities all be less than they otherwise would be. So even though this is a really expensive card, I think it's very easy to curve into this at your top end in the right deck, a control deck. You don't want to be playing this in an aggro deck. You don't want to be playing it in probably not even in mid-range, to be honest. But in a control deck where you're just keeping the board at bay, it's almost like a better Farewell, I feel. And not strictly, obviously, because Farewell's just completely nuking everything. But it can kind of perform the same function of giving you a lot of value. It's almost like the Wandering Emperor mixed with Farewell in a way. The fact that the Wandering Emperor comes down on 4 and gets rid of a threat and leaves behind a Planeswalker is what makes the Wandering Emperor so good, even though 4 mana is overcosted for removing 1 threat. The fact that you have this value engine left over is what makes it so good. And I feel similarly about the Eternal Wanderer here, where even though 6 is a lot, 6 is more than you want to be paying to, like, say, wipe the board, all but 1 creature on the board, because you also get a Planeswalker left behind. I feel like it provides similar value, just in the same way that the Wandering Emperor is better than any, you know, random 3-mana removal spell because of the value it leaves behind. I feel like the Eternal Wanderer can be better than most, you know, sweepers that are maybe a little less costed because of the value it leaves behind. So I think the idea is you control your opponent until you can hit 6 and play this. And then not only can you wipe the board, but you can get a ton of value off the card over time. So I definitely think it's costed well. I do think people are going to be scared of the 6 mana cost at first and shy away from using the card. But I think between the loyalty costs being so cheap on all 3 of them, and the fact that it's harder to kill because they can only attack it with 1 creature, I actually think this card's going to end up seeing a decent amount of play and being really, really good. To the point where I think people are going to cringe when someone plays it. I think it's going to get to that point. It's just, a lot of what makes this card good is subtle, you know. It definitely has to be in the right deck is the one thing, Finn. Certain decks, like, it's just 6 mana is going to be too much. You need to be able to comfortably get to 6 mana, and you need the rest of your deck to be designed in a way where it can comfortably get to 6 mana without too much of a worry. And if that's the case, then this can come down and provide a lot of value. That's true. There is a lot of Planeswalker removal. But I mean, it comes down and wipes the board even if they remove it, right? So if it comes down and wipes their board except for their best creature and gets rid of a removal card in their hand, that's still not so bad, right? Farewell doesn't get rid of a removal card in their hand. So we'll see. I think if you had to build up to this ultimate, I'd be out. At 6 mana, having to build up to the ultimate, I'd be out. Because you wouldn't guarantee 6 mana worth of value before they get the opportunity to kill it. Oh, you get to choose the creature? Okay, it's even better then. I was thinking they choose a creature that they control, you choose a creature you control. Wow. Yeah, this guy's nuts then. The only time it's not going to be great is if they're like, they've got like 1 creature down, like a Leer or a Hullbreaker or something. Then you're going to be in trouble. But even then, you just uptake and exile it, right? Wow. Yeah, this is Ooh, this is going to be obnoxious, guys. This is definitely powerful enough then. It's similar to Farewell. It's less... It's a less consistent answer than Farewell for the same amount of mana, because with Farewell you don't have to worry about anything. You don't have to worry about the situation that the game is in, the board state or whatever. It's just everything's gone. But in the right situations where you can deal with the threats you need to deal with, that you would want to deal with the Farewell, and then be left with this Planeswalker, it can be even better. So, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe you run both. Maybe you run 4 Farewell and 2 Eternal Wanderers, since it's legendary. And that's your 6-drop assortment. But I don't know. 6 drops might be a bit much. I definitely think this guy is going to be gnarly in any deck that tries to drag out the game and can get to 6 mana comfortably. It's going to be wild. Next up, we have Conduit of the Worlds. I actually like this card a lot. This is 2 green mana and 2 colorless, so 4 total for an artifact. And static ability, you just get to play lands from your graveyard, which is pretty cool. If you're using the sack lands from Nuka Penna, you just fetch a land every turn and get 2 landfall triggers every turn, which 4 mana is a bit much for that. But it also has this other ability. You can tap it, choose any non-land permanent card in your graveyard, and if you haven't cast a spell this turn, you get to cast that card. And if you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. So, if you want to play things from your hand, you can't use this for that second ability. When you do use this, you can only play 1 spell a turn, but you get basically unlimited card advantage from the grave. Crucible's what, 3? I think it's the second ability. I think it's really the second ability that's going to be interesting with this one. The fact that you can just keep replaying permanents from your graveyard. The thing that's tricky about it is you only get to play 1 spell a turn, and you can only use this ability on your turn, like a sorcery. So the idea, I think, is you're ramping because of the first ability, so you have expensive permanents in your deck, and every turn you just get to play 1 from your yard, and if they kill it, you get to play it again. If they kill it, you get to play it again, till eventually they can't kill it anymore. The other possibility is, maybe you're not playing expensive things, but you get to play... Maybe you're playing like a flash deck, or maybe you're playing a deck with a lot of instants, and what you can do is you can use this to play something from the graveyard on your turn, and have a bunch of mana left, say go, and then on their turn, still play spells. Play counter spells, or play instant speed removal, or maybe even some flash creatures. I don't know for sure if that's going to be an archetype, if that's where this card wants to go. But it's definitely a possibility, depending on, you know, what kind of support we get as far as those types of cards and that type of archetype. But I think more than likely this just helps you ramp in the right decks, and then you keep replaying your bomb from the yard every time they kill it. Seems interesting. It might be too expensive at 4, or it might just be super powerful, getting to constantly get free cards from the yard, basically. Not free, you have to pay for them, but as far as not taking up a card in your hand. Next up, we've got Black Cleave Cliffs, and this is part of the rare land cycle in the set, so we have confirmation on what at least one of the rare land cycles will be. Black Cleave Cliffs enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands, and then you can tap it for either black or red. So this is going to be really good in a multicolor aggro deck. Because if it comes down early, it comes untapped. Later in the game, it comes down tapped. So any deck where you want access to multiple colors, but you don't care about playing anything expensive, you don't care if your later land drops come into play tapped and you don't have extra mana to play more expensive spells, these are going to slot into pretty nicely. It's going to be all mirrored in fast lands. You're probably right, Finn. But this supports the idea I had about 3-color aggro potentially being a thing. I definitely feel like this makes like my Gruul artifact aggro deck that I put up on the channel not too long ago much more viable. Not Gruul, Naya. You know, if we have some Selesnya or Gruul or Boros fast lands like these, you know, and then we support it with maybe a little bit of Thrawn Portal or Pain lands, like it should be very easy with these lands to play 3-color aggro without having to dip too far into Pain lands and always having untapped lands in your initial turns, which is super important. So I think 3-color aggro could be on its way finally. I know I've been saying it for like 2 sets now, but I think this will get it done. Next up, we've got a reprint. Phyrexian Arena. 2 black and 1 for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose a life. I am... It won't, you say. Yeah, maybe. I am curious if this is good enough anymore. I am really curious. There was a time when this card was insanely powerful. You know, basically drawing 2 cards a turn instead of 1 at the cost of just losing a life every turn used to be insanely powerful. It might still be insanely powerful. I'll definitely try slotting it into a mono black control style deck and see how it does. But I'm super interested to see if it's good enough anymore. For a bittersweet moment, Jace believed he could still save his love. A moment was all Vraska needed. For the glory of Phyrexia, she whispered. Vraska kills Jace? Oh, Jesus. Dude. There's definitely got to be some time travel shenanigans. There's so many Planeswalkers dying. That's got to be what Aftermath is, right? They go back and correct the timeline or something. March the Machine's Aftermath. Leaves him in a state to be completed? Yeah, maybe. Next up, we've got Dragonwing Glider. Now, these equipments are looking kind of interesting. It looks like there's a cycle. This is a rare equipment, 2 red and 3. Has an equip cost of 2 red and 3. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and flying and haste. So it's almost like Embercleave, but not quite. But this has the keyword for Mirrodin. Whenever this equipment enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 red rebel creature token and attach this to it. So pretty cool. So for your 2 red and 3, your 5 mana, you essentially get a 4/4 flying haste dude. That when it dies, leaves behind the equipment to go on something else and give something else +2/+2 flying and haste. I think that that's pretty good. Even though 4/4 flying haste isn't quite on rate for 5 mana, it's like a scuffed Goldspan dragon. The fact that it leaves behind this equipment is pretty good, and also the fact that you can flicker the equipment and make another 2/2 token. That's a thing you can do too, and I'm not sure how viable that will be, but at the very least we know that the Eternal Wanderer can flicker this thing to make more 2/2s. I think this one isn't quite as good as some of the other equipment I've seen, or at least one of the other equipment I've seen further down in the spoilers, but still pretty interesting. Then we've got another one of the fast lands here. This is Copperline Gorge. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. Taps for Gruul mana. Where fire meets ferocity, a greater evolution begins. Next up, we've got one of my favorite cards that I've seen. This just looks gnarly. This is Skrelv's Hive. 1 white and 1 for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. And then you have a corrupted ability, where as long as your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, all creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. This is super cool. It's like a Bitter Blossom. You're getting a 1/1 every turn, and they're stacking up. They've all got Toxic 1. They're all hitting your opponent and giving your opponent poison counters. But once your opponent gets to 3, now they're all hitting your opponent and gaining back all the life you're losing, because every turn you lose a life when you make this Might. So the fact that eventually you're turning on lifelink and then gaining back all the life that you lost is pretty cool. But there's a little bit of extra value baked in, where if you're playing this paired with other toxic creatures, you can get that corrupted ability to trigger on those toxic creatures, even if your mites have been dying in combat or what have you. So that's pretty cool. You know, you can give your other toxic creatures the lifelink, and this just keeps spitting out creatures. Makes me wonder if some kind of a life gain / toxic combination deck could be in the cards, because a card like this that uses 1 life every turn is usually pretty good to supplement a deck that is deeper into life gain as an archetype, to offset the life loss. But don't underestimate a creature factory like this, especially at such a low cost. You get this out on turn 2, and you're getting a free creature every turn for the rest of the game. Granted, they can't block, but your opponent has to keep back blockers, or they're just going to rack up the poison counters. And even the most aggressive deck, I don't think, is going to be able to race you when they're basically at half health, because you only need 10 poison counters to die instead of 20 damage. So even the most aggressive deck that's trying to race you, if they're not holding back blockers and all your mites are getting through, like, you're probably winning the race. So even though these guys can't block, they can put your opponent into an awkward situation where they maybe can't attack with all of their creatures. And that's sort of better than being able to block with them. Because you're not losing creatures in the process, right? They're just holding stuff back and not swinging, and you're staying alive. And then eventually you got the lifelink, so this could actually be really good against aggressive decks. Hard to say, but super fun card. I'm excited to build around it. It's going to be really good in sacrifice archetypes as well. Next up, we've got Kemba Ka Enduring. This is a 2/2 legendary cat cleric for 1 white and 1. Whenever Kemba Ka Enduring or another cat enters the battlefield under your control, attach up to 1 target equipment you control to that creature. Equipped creatures you control get +1/+1. And if all that wasn't enough, you can pay 2 white and 3, so a total of 5 mana, to create a 2/2 white cat creature token. And what's cool is when you activate that ability, it'll trigger the first ability of Kemba, so you get to attach an equipment to the token you just made for free, and then it gets +1/+1 because it's equipped. Is equipment finally going to be viable? I don't know. They've tried so many ways to make equipment work in Standard, and there have been so many sets where it's like, oh, here's the set, equipment's pushed, equipment's going to be viable, and it's still not viable. Maybe this is the time. You know, we've got these new equipments that are creating token creatures when they come into play and attaching themselves for free, so that they're not too expensive to make work. And now you've got this crazy equipment lord that's pretty cheap to get out, pretty on rate and pushed, regardless of equipment. I mean, just a 2/2 for 2 that's got this 5 mana activated ability to make 2/2s is pretty decent on its own. But if you compare this with the right equipment, it's buffing up all your equipped creatures. and you're getting to equip things for free. That's a lot. That's a lot of value in the right deck. So I'm hoping equipment is finally viable. This is one of my favorites as well. Let me drink. I'm starting to lose my voice. Glorious nectar. Nectar of the gods. Alright. Urabrask's Forge. 1 red and 2 for an artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you put an oil counter on Urabrask's Forge, and then you make an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on the Forge. You have to sacrifice that token at the beginning of the next end step. I think in just the right deck, this could be really good. The fact that it has trample is what puts it over the top as far as being aggressive. You know, the first turn you put it into play, you're attacking with a 1/1, whatever. Next turn, you get a free 2/1 trample swinging in, then a 3/1 trample swinging in, then a 4/1 trample swinging in, then a 5/1 trample swinging in. You're just constantly applying more and more pressure every turn without having to expend any resources, without ever having to spend mana. On top of that, because it creates a new creature every turn, if you're playing this in a sacrifice deck, you get to have a free creature to sacrifice every turn to trigger things. You could play this with Braids. You could play this with what's his name? The Rakdos Planeswalker there, the 3-drop. I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. Obnixilis, right? You can play this with lots of different sack outlets to get extra value, and just constantly be applying more and more pressure to your opponent every turn without having to spend any more mana. You could spend all of your turns doing whatever you want, playing the things you would normally want to play, without ever having to worry about spending anything on the Forge again, and it just keeps applying pressure to your opponent every turn, without ever having to spend anything. Yeah, and eventually it gets so big, you could sack it to an Obnixilis to make a token that can immediately ultimate, which is kind of wild. I think the trample is what really puts this card over the top. So I am very excited to brew around it. Welcome to the stream, by the way, Grixis Leader. Glad to have you here. Yeah, I think this could be super powerful. And again, like Finn was saying, Proliferate is the thing in this set too. So you can get those oil counters to go up very quickly, theoretically. Especially if you're in a Grixis deck. Haha, Grixis. You can probably, I know blue's probably going to be the primary color for Proliferate, I assume. Could be green. I don't remember. But, yeah, I like the idea of just set and forget this, and every turn it's contributing more and more pressure to the field, while you can just play whatever else you want and never have to think about it again. There's also later on a land that helps us even more. Alright, well, we'll get cracking to more spoilers then. Next up we have Evolved Spinoderm. Here's another really good pushed green card. I really think they're trying to bring green back. This is a 5/5 Phyrexian Beast for 2 green and 2. It enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove an oil counter. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove an oil counter. And if it has no oil counters on it, you sacrifice it. So it's a 5/5 for 4 that eventually goes away after 4 turns. But as long as it has more than 2 oil counters on it, it has hexproof. And if it has 2 or less oil counters on it, it has trample. So it comes into play as a 5/5 hexproof for 4. And the next turn it's also a 5/5 hexproof. And then the next turn it's a 5/5 trample. And then the next turn it's a 5/5 trample. And then the next turn it's dead. And if you proliferate, you can extend the life of this card and keep it from dying. And if you're careful about when you proliferate, you can have sort of selection about whether you're letting it keep hexproof or trample. You can wait until it loses enough counters to get into trample territory before you proliferate, so that you can keep trample on it for more turns, or you could proliferate early and keep as many oil counters on it as possible and just keep it having hexproof. I'm seeing a trend with the green cards where a lot of them are like, you get this extra value for a limited number of turns, where if you're being super aggressive, it shouldn't matter that after so many turns you're losing the extra value. We saw this in the Gruul creature earlier. If you can just end the game quick enough, it's not going to matter that you're running out of oil counters. Because all of these creatures are such good tempo plays that are putting you ahead tempo-wise, that you can just really push to close out the game before all these oil counters go away. And the fact that it's getting trample for its last 2 turns in play just even helps that much more. You get the hexproof initially to make sure you can put in work with the card before your opponent can target it with removal, so that you're not getting blown out. And then, before it dies, you're getting trample for 2 turns so that you can help just close out the game, get in there for damage before you lose the creature. Just win and you'll be set. Yeah, pretty much. But I'm seeing a trend in a lot of these green cards where they all come down and they're better than they should be for a certain amount of turns. They can do more, and then they run out of gas. But I mean, if all of your creatures are doing that, and you're just bum rushing your opponent with all this above rate pressure, it shouldn't matter that you eventually run out of gas, because you should be putting more pressure on your opponent than they can deal with. Which in turn means that control might be much stronger in the next format, the next standard format, because you're getting all these hyper aggressive above rate creatures that are trying to put in as much work as possible in a short amount of time. So being able to stay on rate against those creatures with normal creatures is a lot harder. But being able to just deal with the threats and remove them with a control deck is not any more difficult. So, well, with the exception of, hexproof and all that good stuff. Stop taking all them turns, just win faster. Then we've got Chiromonics. We've already talked about this on the channel, but we'll go over it again just really quickly. This is a 3/3 legendary Phyrexian rat for 2 black and 1. Has Toxic 1s. Toxic 1 gives all your other rats Toxic 1. And when it enters the battlefield, you get to look at the top 5, reveal any number of rat cards, put the reveal cards into your hand, and put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So, Theo Vaughn. Theo Vaughn? What you talking about? Why are we flipping tables? Why are we talking about Theo Vaughn? Have we seen any other rats yet? I don't recall seeing any other rats. I'm super curious to see if the set's loaded up with rats or not. I don't feel like it should be. He's a comedian with the nickname The Rat King. Ah, I got you. I knew the name. There is at least one. I don't feel like rats should be a theme for new Phyrexia or Mirrodin, but so my initial hope is that there's some kind of different mechanic that supports this, where maybe there's like shapeshifters, or maybe there's, I don't know, something that counts as rats for Chiromonics' ability, while thematically making a little bit more sense with the fact that we're going to Mirrodin or new Phyrexia. But it's probably just going to be rats. Giving a rat death touch. Going in the Brawl deck? Yeah, definitely going in the Brawl deck. Next up, we've got Ovika, Enigma Goliath. This is a prime recursion target, if I do say so myself. This is 1 red, 1 blue, and 5 for a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Nightmare. What a crazy card type. Has flying and ward 3 mana and 3 life. So 6/6 flying, ward, pay 3 and 3 life for 7 mana. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you create X 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. Those tokens gain haste until end of turn. But they don't die at end of turn. You keep them forever. But they do gain haste. So very aggressive. I feel like this belongs in a recursion deck. Because it's expensive, and recursion spells could pop it out of the yard quicker than you can play this. But also, when you play those recursion spells, they're still decently costed non-creature spells. So, it will, if you already have Ovika in play, and you play another recursion spell for another creature, it's going to trigger the other ability on Ovika and give you a bunch of 1/1 Phyrexian Goblins with haste. Or maybe, there might be other ways to use this. I'm trying to think of ways that decks that can both ramp this out earlier than intended, while also having enough non-creature spells to trigger the ability. And the first one that comes to mind is recursion. So I feel like maybe this belongs in a recursion deck. I mean, you could bring this back with a portal and then play a portal and make 9/1/1s or something. But if you can play the portal, then you have enough mana to play the Ovika, right? So I don't know. I don't know exactly where this wants to go, but it definitely wants to go in a deck that can get this out earlier than turn 7, while also having the majority of the deck be non-creature spells, so that you can make lots of goblins. Seems pretty cool. Thematically, I love that it's a Phyrexian Nightmare, and it is a nightmare to get rid of. Next up, we've got Mercurial Spelldancer. This is 1 blue and 1 for a 2/1 Phyrexian Rogue that can't be blocked. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on the Spelldancer. Whenever the Spelldancer deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it, and if you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. So the idea is, you play 2 non-creature spells, you swing in with this, your opponent can't block, you remove the 2 counters, and then you get to copy your next spell. Now, the copy does not trigger putting an oil counter on the Spelldancer. That is something to keep in mind. So you actually have to cast 2 spells. But if you swing in, remove the 2 oil counters, hit, choose to double your next spell, second main, you play an instant or sorcery, you make a copy of it, that first instant or sorcery is going to put another oil counter on it. Which means once it gets going, every other spell is copied. So you play a spell to put an oil counter on, you play a spell to put an oil counter on, copy it. Play another spell, put an oil counter on, play another spell, put an oil counter on, and copy that spell. So every other spell gets copied, and you're constantly swinging in for 2 damage unblockable. The more I think about it, the more I think this card is nuts. In the right deck, of course. You're going to have instants and sorceries that you want to copy during your second main phase, because you have to have already dealt combat damage in order to copy your next spell, and it only lets you copy the next spell you play that turn. So you have to copy a spell on your second main phase. So it can't be a combat trick. It can't be something you want to play on your opponent's turn. It's going to be interesting trying to figure out exactly what you want to copy. I could see maybe an Is It Burn deck, where, you know, you cast a spell to kill one of their creatures, you swing in with this, you hit, double your next spell, play a burn spell to their head and double it, 2 burn spells to their head, something like that. Or maybe you're doubling, you know, you're casting a removal spell to kill something and then you're doubling a card draw spell, something like that. I'm not 100% sure exactly where this card wants to go, but when it gets there, it's going to be powerful. There's definitely going to be a powerful archetype that uses this card. Being able to double every other spell while also swinging in for 2 damage unblockable every turn for only a 2-drop, that's a lot of value. A lot of value. Next up, we've got Tablet of Completion. This is a 2-mana artifact. You can tap it to put an oil counter on it. You can tap it to add a colorless mana, but activate only if Tablet of Completion has 2 or more oil counters on it. You can pay 1 and tap it to draw a card, but activate only if it has 5 or more oil counters on it. I think this card's going to be really good in the right deck, and I don't think anyone's going to see it coming. On its own, it's just okay. You play it on turn 2, you tap it, you put an oil counter on it. On turn 3, you tap it, you put an oil counter on it. On turn 4, you now have a mana rock. But if you keep using it as a mana rock each turn, then you don't ever get to draw cards, because it's never going to get any more oil counters, and it's just going to be a mana rock. You have to stop using it as a mana rock for 3 more turns to get up to 5 oil counters before you can start drawing cards off of it. So the fact that you have to skip using it as a mana rock 3 extra turns after it becomes a mana rock before it gets to the point where it can draw a card, that's a big ask. I don't think this is going to be amazing in every deck, but if there is enough support for Proliferate, I think this card is going to be absolutely insane. Because if you can just keep proliferating for other reasons, because your other cards want you to proliferate, and you're proliferating like every turn all the time, or at least almost every turn, you never have to tap this. Other than the first turn it comes into play, you never have to tap this to put an oil counter on it ever again. You play it on 2, you put an oil counter on it, you say go. The rest of the game, you're just playing what you would normally play, and you're proliferating the way you would normally want to proliferate to add counters on all the things you want to add them to anyway. And this is just getting counters and building up and doing things for you anyway. Like, on turn 3, if you play a Proliferate card, this goes up to 2 counters, immediately turns on, and then you can tap it for a mana that turn. Then, over the course of the next 3 turns, you're using it for mana every single turn, while also casting things that proliferate, or maybe activating abilities that proliferate. And so you're not denied the ability to use this as a mana rock, while still putting oil counters on it, and getting to the point where you can draw cards off of it, without having to avoid using it as a mana rock. And then, you know, once you've proliferated 3 other times, and it gets to 5, now it's like, you can either use it as your mana rock to ramp your things out, or you can just start drawing a second card every turn for only 1 mana. With no downside. That's insane. So, in a vacuum by itself, I think this card is kinda meh. It'll be decent in limited. But if you build around it and you're able to utilize Proliferate consistently enough and aggressively enough, and this just happens to be getting that value incidentally while you're doing all the other things you would normally be doing with Proliferate, then this card's going to be a beast. I'm absolutely going to try to build the Proliferate deck. It's going to be one of the first decks I try to build, because the payoff just seems like it could be insane if the support is there enough. We'll have to see. I assume there's going to be enough proliferate that's costed aggressively enough to be a thing, to be an archetype. And if that's the case, then this card is just nuts. I'm pretty excited about it. Next up, we've got one of my favorite cards thematically. I don't know how good it will actually be. But this is Geth, Thane of Contracts. It is a 3/4 for 2 black and 1. It's a legendary Phyrexian zombie. Other creatures you control get -1/-1. So, right off the bat, it feels like you want to use this in a creature light deck, maybe a control deck, because all of your own creatures are going to get nerfed. And it's only creatures you control. It's not your opponent's creatures, so it's strictly a downside. But its other ability kind of makes up for it. Pay 2 black and 1, tap it, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains, if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate only as a sorcery. So, yes, this card has a hell of a downside. But the downside's only a downside if your opponent actually lets this card stick. Otherwise, the downside goes away. And if the card does stick, every turn you get some insane expensive creature out of the yard into play for only 3 mana. It's like the cheapest recursion ability ever. And you can just keep doing it over and over and over without using up a card. While having a 3/4 blocker, if you absolutely need. It's not even like it's not on rate. Like a 3/4 for 3 is fine. It's not great, especially when it gives all your other creatures -1/-1, but I mean, Toxie is my first thought too, but all the slugs are going to die to the static ability of other creatures you control get -1/-1. I think it's still worth using, but I don't know if it's the best grab. I do think it's going to be super fun experimenting with all sorts of big creatures with Geth, Thane of Contracts. Like, what's the worst that can happen? They use up their removal on this card, and now the -1/-1 thing goes away. And if this cost 4 or more, I would think it's super meh. But the fact that it costs 3 means your opponent's not really going to get any tempo advantage killing it. Best case scenario for your opponent, you play this on 3, use your whole turn to play it on 3, say go. They kill it, use their whole turn to kill it, say go. Whatever. You know? And if you want to bring things back from the yard, you're probably supplementing Geth with other graveyard recursion cards as well. So you can just use those to bring Geth back. And then keep bringing other things back, theoretically. So I think this card's actually going to be kind of cool. You think it could be a lethal combo? Could be. That one recursion spell in particular, I think pairs with this really well. Forget what it's called. It's 5 mana to bring back anything, or if it targets something that costs 3 or less, it's only 2 mana to bring back that thing. That'd be really cool because you want to play this with a bunch of creatures that are huge that you want to bring back from the yard that are expensive, which means you're probably going to want other recursion spells that can target those creatures as well, in case you don't get this. And that card does that while also being something that can bring back Geth itself for only a couple mana. The ones would stack. It is legendary. The ones would stack, and in fact, they would affect each other if you had multiples. It is possible to get multiple legendaries in play. Imagine Geth with Ratadrabik. Oh, that's a deck I want to build. Legendary recursion. Geth with Ratadrabik. But then you get a bunch of Ratadrabik tokens that are all killing each other and killing your own creatures, and then it just gets... I don't even know if that'll be good. If you had 3 Geths in play because they're all non-legendary tokens now from Ratadrabik, all of your creatures would be getting -3/-3. And in fact, all the tokens would die because they'd only be 2/2 zombie tokens, right? Yeah, the more I think about it, it would be hilarious. It's got really funny, crazy interactions. It would be hilarious, but it wouldn't be good. Because as soon as you have 3 Geths on the board, 3 Geth tokens at least, or 2 Geth tokens and 1 Geth, all the tokens die. Because there'll be 2/2s getting -2/-2. Oh, you're right. You're right. The clause of it getting exiled instead of putting it anywhere else would mean that it wouldn't trigger Radodrabic. So things you bring back with Geth would not be able to trigger Radodrabic. Still, fun little interactions to think about. Wouldn't actually be a good deck, but still pretty interesting. It seems someone forgot to read the fine print. It'll be fun to try to build around that card. Next, we've got Seachrome Coast. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands. And this is the Azorius one, white and blue. Next up, we've got Unctus Grand Metatect. This is a legendary artifact Phyrexian Vidalcan for 2 blue and 1. It's a 2/4. Other blue creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. Other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. You can pay 1 Phyrexian blue mana, and until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other colors and types. Activate only as a sorcery. So, pretty weird card. On its own, it's just a 2/4 for 3. All of your artifact creatures get buffed. All of your blue creatures loot every time they attack. Or sorry, every time they become tapped. So if you already have a looter and you tap it to loot, it'll loot twice. Or if you tap it for any other thing, it'll loot while doing whatever you're tapping it to do. Could be really interesting with Halo Fountain. But also, you can turn your non-blue or non-artifact creatures into blue or artifact creatures by just spending 1 blue mana. Or if you really need your mana for other things, you can just spend a life. Sorry, 2 life. 2 life. It's interesting and it's weird. I think the primary use is definitely as a lord for artifact creatures, right? And in that way, it can be really cool. But getting a bunch of extra loots as well is interesting. The final ability is just... it's really weird. It makes me think that there's something specific this is intended for. Like, it's supposed to go in an artifact blue deck, but with cards that aren't artifact or blue that you're expecting to turn into artifact or blue. It seems like such a weird niche thing. I'm really interested in what Wizards expects us to do with this card and what kind of archetypes it expects to build up around it. Because the obvious ones just, you know, artifact tribal, pump your team, go for the throat, maybe turn some of them blue to loot some cards as well. But clearly they have some other uses in mind when you have the ability to turn your creatures into blue artifact creatures. They definitely want you to pair this with things that aren't blue and or aren't artifacts. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of cards pop up that help support something like that. Next up, we've got Norn's Wellspring. This is 1 white and 1 for an artifact. Whenever a creature you control dies, you scry 1 and put an oil counter on it. Then you can pay 1 and tap it, remove 2 oil counters, draw a card. This is interesting, and I saw this one earlier, and I've been trying to think, like, is this better or worse than Weatherlight Completed? Weatherlight costs 2, this costs 2. Only this requires white. So, Weatherlight's slightly better in that respect. Their initial abilities are, if a creature dies, scry one and put a counter on it. They both do that. So, equal in that respect. The difference is, if Weatherlight gets to 7 creatures dead, you draw a card. And every time a creature dies, you draw a card. Whereas, with this, every 2 creatures that die, you can pay 1 and tap it to draw a card. So, Norn's Wellspring has a better floor, and Weatherlight Completed has a better ceiling. It takes 14 dead creatures to draw the same amount of cards off of a Weatherlight Completed as you draw off a Norn's Wellspring. But if you get to that point, you draw those cards for free instead of spending 7 mana over 7 turns. And you can draw multiple cards in the same turn instead of only drawing 1 card a turn with Norn's Wellspring. And you get a 5/5 flying creature as well. So, I think Weatherlight Completed has a much higher ceiling, and in certain situations where you just nuke the board and get a bunch of triggers and draw a bunch of cards, Weatherlight can be better. And also in certain tempo situations where you get to 3 counters and then your opponent kills your dude and then Weatherlight turns into a flyer and can crack back, or Weatherlight can dodge their sweeper and then turn into a big flyer and crack back, it can be better. But I think at the end of the day, just being able to consistently draw cards earlier makes the Wellspring much more reliable and better in general. So even though there are situations where the Weatherlight ceiling is so much higher and it can be so much better, I think those situations are uncommon. And most of the time, just being able to draw cards more consistently earlier on with the Wellspring is going to be much better. I mean, turning into a creature is a good thing and a bad thing, depending on the situation. But, it'll be interesting to see if both can go in the same deck. 4 Wellsprings and 2 Weatherlights, maybe? Might be a bit much. But definitely some kind of a sacrifice deck with Norn's Wellspring. And it's just card advantage up the wazoo. Especially like we were talking before with the Proliferate deck. If we can get a Proliferate deck going that's high value, you can get free oil counters off this to draw. And actually, the more I think about it, Proliferate, if Proliferate is viable enough, Proliferate could work well with Weatherlight Completed too. Yeah, this would be pretty cool in a Rata deck. I agree. Drown, so you may breathe again. I'm definitely gonna try utilizing this in slots that I would normally use, like Bankbuster. But also in decks with sacrifice strategies. Next up is probably my favorite card that I want to try to build around that I've seen so far. This is Blade of Shared Souls. 1 blue and 2 for an artifact equipment. Has equip 2. Whenever Blade of Shared Souls becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you may have that creature become a copy of another target creature you control. It also has 4 Mirrodin. When this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then attach this to it. So, this is really cool. I think this is better than most clone cards we've gotten in recent years. First of all, it's worth noting that the 4 Mirrodin ability always makes a 2/2 red rebel, no matter what the color of the equipment is. And I think that's kind of cool. But basically, this is 3 mana to make a copy of any creature you control. Except it's even better than that, because you can then pay 2 mana to move this onto a different creature and turn that creature into a copy of any creature you control, and be left with the 2/2 red rebel on the board afterwards. So you could theoretically put this in a deck where maybe you're making some 1/1 tokens, and maybe eventually you move this over to the 1/1 token, so you have another 2/2 to trade with their 2 toughness creature, but you also still have the 1/1 become a copy of a really good creature you have into play. And the fact that you can keep picking a different creature, almost like Vesuvian Doppelganger, by re-equipping this to something. Maybe you get a better creature into play later in the game. Maybe you have enough mana to now cast your 6-drop or whatever. Next turn, you can just move this again, re-equip, and now target that creature as the thing you want to copy. Very, very cool. I'm going to be trying to break this card every way I can. Vesuvian Doppelganger is my original favorite card from back in the day. I don't know if it's still my favorite card of all time, but definitely from the first generation of me playing Magic back in the day, that was my favorite card, and it always kind of stuck with me. And this is a very interesting, cheaper, value-infused kind of version of that, and I think it's really cool, honestly. And again, it's something that you can flicker and make another 2/2 if you really want to. So I'm super interested in seeing how this works. The only difference this has from a normal type of a clone is it doesn't come into play as the creature initially. It never will. So it's not going to trigger enter the battlefield abilities. For example, you couldn't Blade of Shared Souls and target a Chupacabra to become a copy of a Chupacabra and kill something. You'll never be able to do that. It will only matter what the creature can do when it's in play, and that's what you'll be copying. So that definitely informs how you would build around this card. It's going to take some thought, but I think this could be really, really good in the right deck with the right creatures. Speaking of right creatures, Archfiend of the Dross. 2 black and 2 for a 6/6 Phyrexian demon with flying. That's already insane. What's the downside? Archfiend of the Dross enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from Archfiend of the Dross. Then, if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. How insane is this card? Like, you could just slot this into current mono black and it's going to be nuts. But there's ways to build around it as well. First of all, you only lose the game if it's in play with no oil counters on it. And it always enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it, which means you can flicker this to reset the oil counters. You can sacrifice it or kill it some other way before it loses its last oil counter so that you don't lose the game. Like, it's so easy to get around that lose the game clause. Way easier than most lose the game clauses. You can absolutely prepare for it and see it coming. But while it's in play, it's a 6/6 flyer for 4, and every creature that the opponent controls that dies, they lose 2 life. Every single one. That's insane. Granted, you have to win in 4 turns or get around the lose clause, but like, that should be easy. Just wipe your opponent's board and they die. While swinging in for 6 damage. Even if it's not enough to kill them, you're getting through for 6 flying as well. I could see playing the new Eternal Wanderer with this on the field, and you choose to keep just this one creature. Pick one of their creatures to keep. They sacrifice the rest. Each of them makes them lose 2 life, and you make sure you choose a creature that's on the ground so they can't block, and then you swing in for the last 6. Like, I think there are some other cards that are one-sided board sweeps under certain circumstances. I can't think of any right now, but anything that's like lets you sweep their side of the board while keeping this guy in play is going to be insane. Absolutely insane. Maybe we do damage sweepers. Maybe we play Rakdos, and we do burn down the house, and we do the 3 mana one that does 3 damage to everything, and we sweep their board without killing our Archfiend, and just make them lose a shit ton of life. I don't know. This seems too good, right? If it was like when it ran out of oil counters, it dies, and when it dies, you lose the game, then it would be a whole other story. Like, you'd have to try to keep this guy alive in order to not die. It would be tricky. Yeah. But the way it is, you can just sacrifice it before it runs out of oil counters. Or flicker it. Or phase it out. Or any number of other things. Bounce it to your hand. There's some cards from the last set that bounce stuff back to your hand, your own creatures. Like, there's so many ways to get around this, and it's so cheap. And I mean, it also makes it difficult. Like, your opponent knows you want to eventually lose this to not die, so it's like, do they really want to trade with it? Do they want to trade their huge flyer that cost a lot more than yours for this guy, knowing it gets rid of your lose clause? And how much life did you make them lose before they actually even did it? It's I don't know. The more I look at this card, the more I think it's absolutely insane. Black is too good, man. Black is just way too good. Let's move on. Melira, the Living Cure. This is a 2-mana legendary human scout. It's a 3/3 for 1 white and 1 green. If you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter, and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. So, you can only get 1 poison counter a turn, no matter what. Whether it's from Proliferate, or your opponent hitting you with creatures with Toxic, or whatever. As long as this is in play, you can only get 1 poison counter a turn, which is already a nice foil to poison on a card that's above rate as a creature anyway, a 3/3 for 2. But then the other ability is its best ability. Exile Melira, the Living Cure. Choose another target creature or artifact. When it's put into a graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So at any time at instant speed, you can just exile it so that something that's going to die comes right back. That's gnarly. Or even if it's not about to die, if you know you're going to like sacrifice it later to your braids or something like that, you know, you can target it with Melira and bring it back. Like, it just feels like there's way too much packed onto this one card. It's so pushed. A 3/3 for 2 with the second ability is nuts on its own. Like, absolutely nuts. It's like a way better Selfless Samurai. Way better. But then the fact that you have poison nerf built into the card as well is just kind of insane. And you gotta remember too, it's not just poison nerf, it's also corrupt nerf. Because corrupt looks like it's gonna be everywhere. And if it takes your opponent 3 separate turns of giving you poison counters before they can turn on corrupt, instead of being able to just go, I'll give you 3, corrupt turn on. Like, that slows down corrupt decks big time. I don't know if corrupt decks are going to be a thing, but clearly the keyword is everywhere. It's a mechanic that Wizards is trying to push on us. So this just makes it a lot harder for those decks to go off as early as they want to go. And, yeah, I think this card is insanely pushed. Next up, we've got another insane black card. I don't know how they can keep making black so insane. Black Sun's Twilight, easily the best of the colored suns. 1 black and X for an instant, it's instant speed. Up to 1 target creature gets a -X until end of turn. If X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So first of all, this is the cheapest one of the colored sun spells, because you can get the X is 5 or more thing to trigger by only spending a total of 6 mana. And if you do, something gets -5/-5, and you bring a 5-drop back. 2 for 1. Insane. Not only that, but the -X/-X can be useful even if you're not killing a creature outright. If you can't quite give them -X enough to kill them, but you use it as like a combat trick to get the rest of the way there to kill the creature that you want to kill, you can do that. Or if you've got something with indestructible, you can kill the indestructible thing with this, since it gives it -X/-X. Or even if you just want to take less damage and they're swinging in with a 8/8 and you can only give it -5/-5, you're taking 3 instead of 8 and bringing back a 5-drop into play. Maybe even to block the now 3/3 and kill it. So, oh wait, no, because it comes into play tapped. The creature comes into play tapped, so you wouldn't be able to get that much value. But still, tons of value. Like this is I think going to be a choice piece of removal for black. I think it's going to be the piece of removal in black because of the absolute value that it provides. Where once there was complacence, Sheoldred brought ambition, and soon the will of Yawgmoth reigned. Next up, Graz, Unstoppable Juggernaut. This is a 7/5 legendary artifact creature Juggernaut for 8 mana. Juggernauts you control attack each combat if able. Juggernauts you control can't be blocked by walls. Other creatures you control have base power and toughness 5/3 and are Juggernauts in addition to their other creature types. So the idea is you want to go wide with a bunch of 1/1s and then be able to slam this, and all of a sudden all your 1/1s are now 5/3s. Granted, they all have to attack each combat, including this guy. So you kind of want to use it almost like an overrun, because if you get this into play without really any other creatures around to get value off of it, you're just swinging with a 7/5, and if they block with a 5/5 and trade, it's just dead before you can get extra value off of it, because you have to attack each combat no matter what. But as a finisher, if you went wide with a bunch of 1/1s and then you slam this onto the board, now they're all 5/3s and you're just swinging through with insane damage. That seems really good. Not only that, but they keep all of their keywords. So if you happen to have really cheap tramplers or flyers or even guys with toxic potentially, because now they can't just block the toxic guy and eat it and make it not get through. Now they have to block and have their guy die to all your little mites with toxic 1. That's substantial. It'll be interesting to see the best way to use this, though. Like, you don't want to necessarily use it in a recursion deck because you want to go wide, and you're not going wide in a recursion deck. But you do need to get this out for a reasonable amount of mana when it costs 8 to hardcast. So maybe Power Stones? Or maybe some kind of a ramp deck. I could see it in a deck with Awaken the Forest. Use Awaken the Forest to make a bunch of 1/1 forest creatures, and then on your next turn you use those forest creatures, as many of them as you have to play this. and then whichever ones you didn't have to use to play it can now swing as 5/3s. In fact, have to swing as 5/3s, and then on your next turn, all the rest swing as 5/3s, and this swings as a 7/5. That could be a nice finisher. So yeah, I think this card could be cool in just the right deck. I think the best deck it could fit into is something with Awaken the Forest for sure, because it gives you both of what you want. It gives you the ramp to get the Graz out early, and a bunch of 1/1 creatures that you can turn into 5/3s. Finn is not looking forward to Black Sun's Twilight, since it just slots straight into mono black midrange again. Same with Phyrexia and Arena being just a straight up combo with Shelly. Yeah, pretty wild. So many cool cards. I want to play against none of them. I think Vorinclex is going to be seeing a lot more play. Brendan Friedhausen said that. I said, oh Jesus, here we go. These cards are absolutely insane. I'm excited to use the White Hive and the Blade of Shared Souls. New Wanderer is nuts. Alright. Moving on to more cards. Encroaching Mycosynth. 1 blue and 3 for an artifact. Non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for permanent spells you control and non-land permanent cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. So everything in your deck, in your hand, in play, that isn't a land, is now an artifact. This is very similar to Nexus, that made everything into shapeshifters, except this makes everything into artifacts. It's hard to say how useful this will be. There are a couple cards that make use of it decently well, but I don't think any of those cards are really impacted enough to be worth the 4 mana cost of this card. For example, you have Rain of Machiko. If everything's an artifact, Rain is pumping everything, but are you really going to play Rain of Machiko in a deck that doesn't have all artifacts anyway? Maybe, maybe not. Stuff like Yosha Declares War. You get more artifacts to tap to do damage to things on Chapter 2. But again, these abilities aren't necessarily something that's worth taking 4 mana, taking all of your turn 4 off just to play this. So there has to be something even better, something that combos with this. I assume they're trying to push some kind of a combo archetype with this card. And I'm not sure what that is yet, but we'll have to wait and see what the rest of the cards in this set are. Careful, however they might look, they're not human. A step too close and they'll drag you in. Next up we have another pushed green creature. Holy smokes. This is Bloated Contaminator. It's a 4/4 trample Phyrexian beast for 1 green and 2. 4/4 trample for 3. If that wasn't good enough, it also has Toxic 1. And if that wasn't good enough, it also has the ability, whenever Bloated Contaminator deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. Bandit, stop scratching. "4/4 trample Toxic 1 for 3 mana, and whenever it hits for damage, you proliferate." Now, I believe you get to order the abilities of Toxic and Proliferate. So the Toxic one can hit first and give them a poison counter, and then Proliferate hits and gives them another poison counter. This guy's just nuts. It's just so pushed for 3 mana. Again? Finn says again? It's not a trigger. Okay, so no matter what, the Toxic will happen first, because it's not a trigger. The Toxic happens, and the Proliferate ability gets put on the stack as a trigger. So all of the Toxics will happen first. Interesting. Give this thing double strike, and oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Bloated Contaminator and Lizard Blades, anyone? Lizard Blades on 2. Bloated Contaminator on 3. On 4, you equip the Lizard Blades. Let's go. Might be a little too mana intensive, but it's an idea. Next up, we have Vindictive Flamestoker. I think this is a rare. 1/2 for 1 red mana. It's a Phyrexian Wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it. And again, you can proliferate to add more. You can pay 6 mana, 1 red mana and 6 colorless mana, and sacrifice the Flamestoker. Discard your hand, draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on Flamestoker. So pretty cool. Comes down as a 1/2 for 1. Not super useful in the early game. But eventually it gets enough oil counters. You can just pay 1 red mana, discard your hand, draw 4 cards. That seems kind of insane. It's definitely a card that wants to set up for value later on. It's not going to do a lot in the meantime. But if you're the kind of deck that just wants to capitalize on value, wants to draw a ton of cards later on, and is maybe putting some proliferate into your deck, messing around with some of those mechanics to help this happen even quicker, then this might be a card that makes the cut for a deck for sure. Next up, we've got Rhea Ivor, Bane of Bladehold. This is 1 black, 1 white, and 2 for a 3/4 legendary Phyrexian Knight with Battle Cry. And Battle Cry means whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. At the beginning of combat on your turn, the next time target creature would deal combat damage to 1 or more players this combat, prevent that damage. If damage is prevented this way, create that many 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So, it's a 3/4, gives all of your other creatures +1 attack when it attacks, and you can pick one of your creatures to not do damage if you want to. You don't have to. Because you could just target a creature that's not attacking, theoretically. I guess you have to target something, but if you have even one creature that didn't attack, that sat back because you wanted it to survive or whatever, you could just target that so that all of your creatures are still dealing combat damage. If you want to. But you get to target one of your creatures that is attacking, that hits them for damage, and instead of hitting them for damage, you make that many mites with Toxic 1. Which is cool. You start to go wide with mites. All of the mites are getting +1/+0 when you attack because of Battle Cry. And so they're all attacking as 2/1 mites, which means they're harder to block. Your opponent probably has to trade decent creatures for the mites to prevent them from getting combat damage and putting poison counters on them. So it gets kind of interesting. It's worth noting Battle Cry only triggers when this creature attacks. So as a 4-drop, it's pretty easy for this to attack as a 3/4 and just die in combat. And that makes it not super good. But the second ability you can use even if this creature isn't attacking. And that part is good. If you're just swinging with your team, holding this guy back, you can pick one of your dudes that got through for damage and instead make a bunch of mites. And you can wait until, you know, maybe 3 different turns you got through, maybe with like a 2/1 and then like a 3/2 and then like a 5/4. And now all of a sudden you have 10 mites. Now you can decide to attack with Rhea Ivor with all the mites and whatever other creatures you have, give them all +1 attack, and now your opponent's in a hell of a pickle. And even if they kill Rhea Ivor, that combat step is so effective that it might not matter. So, kind of an interesting card. It doesn't seem super pushed. I don't know if it's quite going to make the cut in standard constructed play, but it's definitely interesting. I'd like to experiment with it. Next up, we've got Monument to Perfection. We're getting pretty close to the end of the spoilers here. This is a 2-mana artifact. You can pay 3, tap it, search your library for a basic, sphere, or locust land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said there are cards that interact with the sphere land type. They also interact with lands that have the locust land type and basics in this, as far as this card in particular. So every turn you can just search out one of these lands, which is pretty cool considering that the sphere and locust lands give you much more value than simply being lands. One of them can copy an artifact. I believe one of them turns into a creature. So being able to search one of those out every turn if you've got play sets of both already seems kind of powerful. Being able to fix your land, ramp, all in the same card, all reusable every turn just by tapping it and paying 3, seems like a decent amount of value. But on top of that, you can pay 3 mana and turn this card, Monument to Perfection, into a 9/9 Phyrexian Construct artifact creature. It will then lose all of its other abilities, so it won't be able to search anymore, but gain Indestructible and Toxic 9. Activate only if there are 9 or more lands with different names among the basic, sphere, and locust lands you control. So, in order to activate the ability, you need 1 of each basic land, and then 4 other unique lands that are some combination of sphere or locust, which is pretty interesting. It's going to take a good amount of setup to get to do that, but the fact that it can as gravy, while also just using the ability that it has to tap and search for lands to ramp you, not necessarily ramp you, but make sure you never miss a land drop, fix all your colors, and find extra value within finding sphere and locust lands. This could be really cool. I don't know if 3 mana every turn ends up being too much to make this card worth it. We're going to have to experiment with decks to see how easy it is to make some of this value worth it in the end. But it's got a lot of value baked into one card. Alright, how many we got left? 1, 2, 3 cards left. The first is another land. This is Mirex. It's a sphere, so it's one of those cards that you can search out with the last card we looked at. You can tap it for colorless mana. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, but activate only if Mirex entered the battlefield this turn. So the first turn it's in play, it can make a mana of any color, but then it's colorless, which is actually very interesting. You can also pay 3 mana and tap it to create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. This card seems really good. I don't know how much only being able to make a mana of any color the first turn is going to matter. It's going to definitely take some experimenting to see what this can slot into while still working out. But the fact that it's a creature engine for only 3 mana, you could just keep making those Phyrexian Mights, seems pretty darn good. Granted, the Mights can't block, so you have to stay aggressive, and having to tap this land and 3 other lands every turn in order to make one keeps you from being aggressive, so there's this weird contrast. Is interesting, but I don't know. The card has a lot of potential. We're gonna have to test it out, see what it might work in. Next up, we've got Mind Splice Apparatus. This is 1 blue and 3 for an artifact with flash. At the beginning of your upkeep, you put an oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on Mind Splice Apparatus. I really want to like this card, but I don't think it's ever going to be worth using pretty much your whole turn and 4 mana to play this, to then slowly start to get cost reductions on your instants and sorceries. It's possible you use this in an instant speed control sort of deck with a lot of counter spells, and you're just holding up your mana every turn, and then you have a turn where you don't need to interact with your opponent, so you just sneak this in at the end of their turn. You flash it in for 4 mana, and then you go about your business, and everything just gets cheaper and cheaper to the point where your opponent can't keep up with your tempo anymore. It's possible, but I don't know, man. Spending 4 mana on a do-nothing artifact is a lot to ask, even with Flash. I think the Flash is the one thing that makes it maybe playable, but I don't know. We're going to have to wait and see. This is a tricky one to try to build around. And the last leaked card we have for right now is the Monumental Facade. It's another Sphere land. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it. And you can tap it for a colorless, or you can tap it and remove an oil counter from it to put an oil counter on target artifact or creature you control. Activate only as a sorcery. Now, this is a really interesting card. It's hard to say how much play it will see. If you're in a colorless deck that is trying to utilize oil counters, I think it's a no-brainer. But otherwise, not being able to get color mana out of this in exchange for getting basically 2 free oil counters to put on whatever you want, it's hard to say if that will work. If you can make this land work in your deck without slowing you down too much, without color screwing you, it can provide a lot of value. It's still counting towards curving out with your lands, and you're getting these extra oil counters without having to use up a spell. So the fact that you don't have to use up a spell to get these oil counters, and it's just a land that you would want to be putting into play to use for mana anyway, it's like if you can get into a situation where it's not color screwing you and it's not slowing you down from the cards you want to be playing because of the fact that it can't make colored mana, then it's just extra value, free oil counters, and some of the things that we've seen with oil counters can really benefit from 2 free oil counters, from just speeding up that process or slowing down the process of something losing oil counters, you know? So, like, maybe in a mono black deck with that 4 mana 6/6 we saw, that you lose the game if it runs out of oil counters, it'd be really easy to play this in a mono black deck and not get mana screwed and just get 2 extra oil counters on that thing whenever you get it into play. That seems pretty good. Not only that, but you can wait until it loses some of the oil counters before you put oil counters on, so that your opponent doesn't blow you out. If you just play the 4-drop with 4 oil counters and then immediately you're like, haha, put an oil counter on it, and then they just kill it, it's a little wasteful. But if you bide your time and wait until it gets down to like 1 or 2 oil counters, or wait until they try to kill your Monumental Facade, and then, you know, well, I guess you can't do it when they try to kill it because it's only as a sorcery, but still, how many things are they going to have that kill lands anyway? So you wait until you get down to 2 or 1 or 2 oil counters, and then you put an oil counter on, and you keep it alive. But you make sure that if your opponent's going to remove it, you still have your oil counters on your Monumental Facade to add to something else later. I definitely feel like there are certain decks this will be able to slot into, but it's going to have to take very careful mana consideration before getting there. And that's all of them. I think the cards we've seen so far are pretty insane. I think green is finally getting a push. I'm a little upset that black is still getting pushed so hard. I feel like it doesn't need it, and black's going to continue to dominate, which makes me a little sad. But who knows? Maybe green's getting pushed so much that it can make a comeback. Maybe some of these control cards that we're seeing is going to keep black in check. It's hard to say, but I'm excited to see the rest of the cards. I'm excited for spoiler season to officially start so we can see the rest of the cards in this set, and I'm looking forward to it. So we'll see what happens. thanks so much for checking out my channel. We are pushing hard for that 1,000 subscriber mark, so please consider subscribing. Hit that button, there's a circle in the middle, over there, hit that, subscribe, tell all your friends to do it. Thank you. Also, give this video a like so more people can see it. If you'd like more PlayStation and console game coverage, we've got that down below. And if you'd like more Magic the Gathering coverage, there's more of that somewhere off over that way. Do all the things.